Thank you so much, Minister. I mean, what a fantastic way to set the scene for today. Really good to hear about the Ireland for Finance strategy, and within that, the fintech innovation being such a crucial part of that. And I think you set out lots of issues there that we will be covering in our discussions during the day. So I picked out, for example, what are the right conditions to allow fintech to flourish? And you mentioned picking up what Ian said there, the need for investment. So how is the government helping to ensure that the funding and the investment is put into the fintech sector, but also stability, so Ireland being a great place to come and invest, but then the need for skills and education across the public sector, if we're going to embrace this in governments, the regulatory environment, and we have a specific session on regulation because that can dominate quite a lot of the conversations around fintech, so we're making sure we cover that in one of our sessions today. Facilitating innovation, you mentioned the hub and the sandbox, so those issues will definitely come up in sessions later on in the day. The importance of collaboration, not just across sectors, across the public and private sectors, but also across countries, and exactly what we're doing today, kind of sharing experiences and sharing ideas with each other. Digital transformation across governments being that foundation and the building block on which fintech can happen, and then ending with the need to manage the risks and making sure that we are dealing with all of those as we adopt the new technologies. Thank you so much, Minister. A fantastic way to start the day. And now we are going to move into our first panel session. So I'm going to invite our first speakers for our panel session to come up on stage. So Karen, Dominic, Peter and Robert, if you could make your way up on stage, that would be fantastic. Does anyone have slides? Yes. Okay, so we did mention that we will be building in a lot of time for interaction. So we're going to kick off with exactly that in this panel. So the first panel is all about governments and fintech. Are governments on the right path? So are we doing some of those things that we just heard from the ministers? Are we putting the right conditions in place in the public sector to make sure that we can fully embrace the potential of fintech? In terms of the format, what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite each of our speakers to give some opening remarks to help start the conversation. And then we will be throwing it over to all of you in the audience. So please, from now, be thinking about the questions that you want to put to our speakers, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of the session. So in terms of our great speakers for this first panel session, we have Karen Cullen, who was already mentioned, who's the head of International Financial Services Unit and Fintech Steering Group at the Department of Finance here in Ireland. Then we've got Dominic Fraudenthaler, who also was referenced in Ian's opening remarks, who's the fintech expert sitting in the Federal Ministry of Finance in Austria. And then we have Peter Oakes, who is the founder of Fintech Ireland, so we'll be able to give that kind of perspective looking in as well to the public sector. And last but by no means least, we've got Robert Rampra, who is the Undersecretary for Insurance and Capital Market Division at the Ministry of Finance, who has come from Slovenia. So I'm sure you'll agree with me. We have a fantastic panel. As I said, please do take this opportunity to put your questions to our great panel. But first, Karen, I'm going to invite you to give some opening comments.
Thank you, Siobhan. Okay, so I just have 2 slides, don't worry, not too many. So I think this first slide is a good recap of some of the things that the Minister of State mentioned earlier. So we have the Ireland for Finance strategy, which, as he said, is a whole of government strategy for the international financial services sector. The strategy is based around 5 themes, and as he said, fintech and digital finance is a priority theme under the strategy. So the other priority theme is sustainable finance, and sometimes we find that those 2 themes, sustainable finance and fintech, can work pretty well together, and I have a little case study to mention later on, if you remind me to mention some of my case studies. So This is, I suppose, a graphic that represents the formal government strategy. It's very much also a strategy that collaborates with the private sector, so it's a public-private strategy. The strategy is implemented by way of annual action plans, which means that we can constantly refresh the strategy, and it's actually implemented by way of practical actions and annual action plans. So that's kind of an overview of the strategy and the background to our formal engagement with the private sector. So every year the private sector and stakeholders can submit proposals to the department, and we can then assess the proposals, and perhaps the measures then will come into the annual action plans. So that, as I said, is an overview of the formal strategy in terms of the context and the background and how we engage with the private sector. So this next slide, I suppose, is a representation of the formal engagement structures. So the Minister of State chairs the joint committee that he mentioned earlier that meets every quarter. This joint committee oversees the Ireland for Finance strategy and implementation. The joint committee is made up of two subcommittees there. So it's on the left-hand side, we have the high-level implementation committee. So that's the public sector committee. So the members of that would basically be the Department of Finance, the Department of Taoiseach or the Prime Minister's Office, the Department of Enterprise, the government agencies, the IDA, the FDI, Agency Development Agency, and Enterprise Ireland, which looks after Indigenous Irish companies. And then we have Department of Further Education, and also the Central Bank is an observer to the Joint Committee. And then on the other side we have the Industry Advisory Committee. So that is where the industry experts talk to government about the trends and what they think is good about the system or what maybe needs to be improved about the system. So that's a very good conversation to have with the industry experts themselves. So the actual high-level senior people from the firms themselves rather than the representative associations, so people who are actually doing the work. So there's a wide range of private sector representative or experts there from all of the subsectors within international financial services, but particularly on fintech. There are a number of firms represented there that you may know, Fexco, for example, IDPAL, and many more from the fintech side. And then I suppose in the public sector, we have another couple of groups. We have our government, our cross-government fintech groups that meet on particular issues. So particularly at the moment we're meeting in relation to the proposal for a national fintech hub and whether the costs and merits of that. So that's very much at the early stage. We're waiting for industry to input further into that. And then you might have heard me talking about our Department of Finance Fintech Steering Group. So we find that fintech is a topic that's very much influences a lot of regulatory policy areas in the department. So obviously payments is a big area, but then obviously there's banking, there's open banking, and then insurance, sustainable finance. So there's a lot of regulatory policy people within the department that I need to keep in touch with to understand what's happening in the regulatory policy space. And sometimes we agree on measures that we need to implement in the annual action plan. And then this year, or I should say the previous Minister of Finance, the Minister of State Jennifer Carroll McNeill, hosted some fintech workshops with the industry. She wanted specific views from a wide range of industry people. I suppose we have, as I said, quite a mature regulatory, quite a mature fintech ecosystem, and a lot of the players really are interested in talking to government. So, you know, I can maybe talk a little bit later about the case studies, but I suppose that's our formal engagement structures. I can talk a little bit more about the elements of the ecosystem as we go through the panel.
Brilliant, thank you, Karen. Yeah, it would be good to hear about the case studies later on, how you're already using fintech in the public sector, but really interesting there just to see the extent to which you are building in your governance structures, that collaboration and partnership with the private sector, but also that need to work across departments internally as well. And I think that will raise lots of questions about the joined-upness of kind of the approach across governments, and also the skills that I think public servants have to be able to do some of these things. And it'd be interesting to know how successful those workshops were as well, maybe when we come back to you on that. Thank you so much, Karen, for all of that. Dominic, over to you.
Thanks. So just to give you a short introduction to my person, so my name is Dominic Freudenthal. I work for the Austrian Ministry of Finance for quite some time now, since 2012. I started in the field of regulatory, and from my regulatory experience, I actually was deployed in the, you mentioned all the structures in order to engage with the private sector, in the Fintech Advisory Board of Minister Löger, and I was heavily involved with the creation, conceptation and implementation of the sandbox in Austria. I talked about that last year, and you already talked about the engagement possibilities that governments have with the private sector, so I'm not going to annoy you with that anymore. But what I wanted to give you a short tour d'horizon is the other possibilities. I mean, in the intro, we from Barbara Völkl from Germany heard that fintech is quite a fugitive term. You can't be very sure what it actually means. And I think, or the 3 points that I wanted to make are actually, government can engage via regulation. That's what the European Union does. That's what we usually do in implementing laws and so on, or what we do when we help private sector companies in order to cope with regulation, for example, in a sandbox. We can enable people and empower people to use technology related to financial services and other government services related to finances. That's what I'm going to focus on in my short presentation. And the third thing, probably we can come back on in the discussion later, is of course financial means. I think that is also a very crucial topic for fintechs. So the first thing I wanted to show you, I mentioned it last year in the last panel, is actually the Austrian eID system. It was relaunched last year? No, it was this year actually. And it is picking up users very quickly. So we have an eID system for quite some long time now, but ID Austria is actually very successful. It has about 2.6 million users already. And I'm mentioning ID Austria, or the eID system, that are compliant with the eIDAS regulation, because to my opinion, this is something where the government can enable people to use digital services with a much better user experience. Because if you think about your own experience when you're using financial services, it usually is a hassle to remember different passwords, to remember every login, to do the onboarding every time again. And if you have a well-established and well-used eID system that can be used across sectors, this makes user experience a lot better, and also makes the services a lot safer, because the requirements for enhanced or qualified signature services in the eIDAS regulation are very strict. Of course, I can't be here on this panel without mentioning one of our flagship products we have in the Ministry of Finance, which is Finanz Online, or Finance Online, where you can do your tax filings in Austria. It is a very successful system. Since its establishment, we have had about 280 million tax filings in Austria. It is actually, I would say, the predominant system in order to do your tax filings in Austria. It has about 6.3 million users. Now you probably will ask why 6.3 million users in Finance Online if you only have 2.6 million users in ID Austria, because you actually can use the system also via other possibilities to enter it. So just to mention that. Something very recent I wanted to touch upon, because it is also related to ID Austria. It was actually launched just this minute. Please forgive me that it is all in German, because it's just a screenshot of our homepage, is Bundesschatz. It's a translation or it should be translated to Austrian treasuries. And it was just announced this week that the Austrian Ministry of Finance is offering to individuals Austrian government bonds. I would say probably call it treasuries, because it's not a bond in a strict term. So you can, as an individual, give your money to the Republic of Austria, which is a very strong debtor. Actually, we have a AA+ stable rating in Austria, and you do get quite nice interests for your money that you give to the Republic. And actually, one of the key aspects of this new relaunched Austrian treasuries for individuals is that you can access it with ID Austria. So actually, to open an account with the Austrian Treasury for individuals is you just need like 60 seconds to a minute to open your account and to invest your money into the Republic. That is also possible with, sorry again in German, with green investment. So the Republic of Austria is actually ensuring that the money that you give to us is used for green projects, from railway system to power grids and all the other green elements that you might find. Another aspect where you can use the ID Austria again is the Austrian pension tracking. So in the first pillar, you can actually track your pensions, and you could do that very easily via ID Austria again. So you can actually access the payments that your employer makes for you and see what your current status of your pension would be. And that is, if you have one system, very easily done. And also on the second pillar, for example, it's more common to use ID Austria now. And of course, our big hope is that also the private sector will take over the ID Austria system once people are very well used to it, because it is just an enhancement for user experience. So this is mainly the things I wanted to talk about in my short presentation. This very last picture, probably also just a little mentioning of other projects we do with ID Austria. You see a policeman in the background, so we digitalized the Austrian driving license and also the registration for your car. So if you have a police check, you will not need any paperwork anymore. You just need your mobile phone, and you can access all your documents via your mobile. Yeah, and that's pretty much everything I wanted to initially mention.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dominic. Really helpful to have those real use case examples as well. And interesting what having a kind of digital ID means then for the way you can go in other services. And I know some countries are doing that, some countries are not. So that might be quite an interesting conversation to have.
But the thing from my personal experience, and of course everything I say here is under the disclaimer that it is my private opinion, that I personally really see is that you get a platform effect.
Yeah.
Once a lot of people use a system or a platform like ID Austria, it picks up speed.
Yeah.
And if it is a niche product, as it was before it was relaunched to ID Austria, it's not really in use. So you really have to pick up the platform effect also if you offer, as a government, some services to your citizens. And then this publicly offered service probably gets also implemented in the private sector and enables people to use digital services with a better user experience, with higher security standards and a higher adoption rate in the usage of digital services.
Brilliant. Well, as I say, if we have any questions for Dominic on how you set that up and what challenges you overcame, we can take those in a moment when we've heard from everybody. Thanks, Dominic. Peter, over to you.
Thanks. I'm not sure if my slides will be here because they have made it. They were sent rather late. I was going to say that they weren't here. You're missing out on a fantastic presentation. But you'll be the judge. If I could just ask Dominic, since you are providing interest on these bonds, do you think we could extrapolate that across to the digital euro, even when that comes in, so we get interest off our euro stored at the ECB in the wallet? But maybe that's for another panel. fintech across the world. Actually, this this slide is taken from, I've lost his name now, Shirin Savek, who is at the IMF. This is a working paper, and I'll talk about it in just a minute, but Ian already mentioned the growth of fintech investments and then the drop-off, and it dropped off this year in 2023, the lowest it's been for 5 years. But what is interesting in the IMF working paper is sort of showing where there is a number of fintech startups and where they're coming from. So you can sort of see that from Americas and also APAC, and I think the other one was EMEA. And Dominic mentioned, and the Minister mentioned in his speech that fintech can help governments increase public services and improve delivery. And the example Dominic gave of the driver's licence, I know the folk in Denmark who I sat next to last night have digital licences. We have a digital licence in Australia where I come from. And in Ireland, you can get a passport card without going into an office based on your passport. And when I was going through those processes, I stopped and asked myself, would any of those actually have been achievable if there hadn't been regulatory technology applications that were doing the verifications of customers that wanted to open bank accounts? So without that, the innovation in government to improve public services and or increase public services and improve delivery may not have happened at the rate that it did. So I think that was quite interesting to sort of note. Now, in terms of regulated fintechs, I just threw this in because even though the UK is no longer part of the EU, we still love them and we welcome them. And this is showing you the number of regulated fintechs in the European Economic Area and the UK as of actually last night. That's why my slides were so late. So you look across there, you'll see 309, there are 309 authorised e-money institutions in the European Union. There's 417 in the UK. So the UK was still part of the European Union. You'd actually see the skewing towards the UK. What's interesting though is if you have a look at the first bar where it says 309 e-money firms in the EEA, when I last looked at these numbers was back in December 2021 and there was 268, so it's actually grown in the EEA. When you jump across to the next two bars, in blue, the 723, is the number of authorised payment institutions in the European Economic Area versus 238 in the UK. And I guess it's because in the UK, if you're falling between payments and e-money, you'll probably pursue an e-money licence over a payments licence if you have the opportunity. And then when you look at open banking, which has been mentioned, which we'll call account information services providers, it's about even between the EEA and the UK. So those, I just wanted to throw those numbers up because at some point we'll be talking about the challenges and successes. So these numbers may help. But if I just then said, look, if we just focus on the EEA, and sorry, I shouldn't have the UK here because I don't have the split. This is really just the EEA. You'll actually see that Lithuania has the largest number of regulated fintech, and I'm very conscious I'm using a limited definition of fintech here, because fintech is a broad church, so I'm just focusing on e-money, payments and open banking, not the MiFID firms, not the algo high-frequency traders. So Lithuania, followed by France, followed by Germany, the Netherlands and Sweden. So it's interesting that one of the top, so Lithuania, which is not one of the top 5 economies in Europe, has so many regulated fintechs. Now, that's not the only story. If you actually go to the EBA register and then you look at the number of withdrawals of these licences, you may get a clearer picture as to which jurisdictions are really achieving economies of scale in this area. But Ireland, we would sit at 9th. We would have 5% overall of that total number of 1,127. And a depiction of Ireland, because we are here in Ireland and I'm Fintech Ireland, I had to throw this one up. And this just shows you those regulated fintechs in our country. So all those logos on this map are either authorised as an e-money firm, authorised as a payments firm, or they're a virtual asset service provider on their way to becoming a MiCA, or they are crowdfunding, or they're a standalone open banking firm. So there's about just under 70 there. And I work on the board of a number of those companies as a non-exec director, and so I have a lot of experience in how we deal with regulation and what regulation means to us and how we collaborate with government instrumentalities, and a number of those companies that they'd be represented on some of the committees that Karen was mentioning, I believe as well. So I just thought, like, in this paper by the IMF working paper, when it looked at what was the relationship between fintech and economic growth, they looked at a panel of 198 countries between 2012 and 2020. And when I mentioned this to Dominic last night, he said, okay, cut to the chase. What was the conclusion? I said, okay, well, I'll copy and put the conclusion in the slide. Fast-growing fintech is likely to have a greater effect on economic growth in this context, and the regulators and central bankers in the room will love this. Maintaining financial stability, is critical, and at the same time for sustainable growth, and that requires strong regulatory institutions, better technology and regulation, extensive cross-border coordination, et cetera, for these emerging financial institutions. But the numbers about what they have actually added to the economic value of society is measured in the low digits. It's not up there in 20, 30 or 40%, but that's a low base from which it starts. So hopefully that's sort of a bit of context when we can talk about success and failures and other things. So.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Peter. Yeah, really interesting to hear about all the types of companies that are involved in this kind of fintech ecosystem, but also I think echoing a lot what the Minister said in terms of the conditions that you need. So on that slide there, you've got strong regulatory framework, but also good monitoring as well. And then, as you say, again, mention that collaboration, so cross-border kind of collaboration as well as cross-sector. Thanks so much, Peter. I'm sure people have got lots of questions and we will come back to those. And then, Robert, over to you.
Yes, thank you. So maybe to start, I work in the Ministry of Finance, of course, in the Insurance and Capital Division. We don't have a fintech dedicated unit or anything like that, but would be, of course, something maybe for future. But we definitely wish, this is Slovenia, to enhance the fintech environment we have. Maybe just to give you a brief overview of, at the beginning of, I mean, these are basically the fintech companies that we identify at the moment. There are roughly 20 to 40 fintech companies, depending on how you define it, working, and it's kind of stagnating environment as we feel. So, I mean, there was a surge of, especially in the crypto and blockchain technology companies during the surge 2018, but now as the market matures, you feel that that many of companies didn't find the business model to continue operating, or they are moving to other jurisdictions outside Slovenia, maybe in Europe or somewhere else. And this has, of course, give us indication that we need to do maybe some more strategic orientation of how to continue to doing and promoting business fintech in Slovenia. So Slovenia is a very small market, so we also aware that fintech companies that operate in Slovenia, of course, need to find markets elsewhere as well, but that still that they continue, let's say, having their headquarters or a company is located somewhere in Slovenia. So we try to incorporate fintech in our strategy for capital market development, which we launched last year. It has three pillars. So it's digitalization is our first pillar. Here we actually wanted to also promote especially improving financing for SMEs, and also we find that fintech companies often find difficulties in financing in the later stage especially. Then we also want to have expansion of financial products that will be available in our capital market, and also promotion of digital literacy. Maybe on this case, maybe I can just also mention, I'm now working in the Ministry of Finance since 2021, but before I worked for a few years in the World Bank, and during that time I actually voluntarily joined a group of people who worked on a joint project between IMF and the World Bank called Learning Coin, and the project intention was not to launch a cryptocurrency of IMF or something, but it was more to encourage staff to learn about blockchain technology and how to use it, maybe to improve developing projects, or how to improve some kind of where there are some deficiencies in market. For instance, financial inclusion, that was of course important topic in the World Bank. And something similar, so it's hard to, of course, to have in a small ministry like Slovenian, but anyhow. So building on this strategy, we are now setting a new project. So we actually have, I'm involved in two of them. One of it's ongoing. It's the Fintech Roadmap project. So the intention of this Fintech Roadmap project is to develop a detailed roadmap for Fintech ecosystem in Slovenia, to identify potential areas for improvement and propose concrete initiatives to create maybe a more favorable and attractive environment for fintech. So we already indicated what are the problems of issues. For instance, in Slovenia we have 3 regulators, so we don't have a single entry point for fintechs to come. Our supervisories, so regulators have launched its innovation hubs, they're calling, or similar, but they don't, as it seems now, it's not so used by the fintech companies for now, and especially also there are 2 of them, so maybe that's one of the areas. We should probably think of sandboxes, but we also hear many occurrences where sandboxes don't work that well. That would be also interesting. So in that regard, we are looking for partnering with others. For instance, I went to a study tour to Taiwan, and to see how is the fintech, of course, in that more developed country in Asia is. So what are they doing? And they are also kind of looking at how they can help Slovenia in that regard. So very interesting project. Maybe another one that I could mention is we are developing also conditions to launch a platform for DLT on DLT platform for maybe a tokenized securities. It could also be an interesting project, but I think it's something that private sector has to do. But we would like to set conditions for this platform to maybe enhance environment. So in essence, yeah. So we are still maybe so we are not on the list Peter has mentioned yet. I'm not sure if we're going to be on that list soon on top of it, but definitely I think we can. I think the component of fintech in our, let's say, financial landscape is important, and it is important to the ministry. And we think that we can do more, and it will be an interesting journey, definitely.
Brilliant, thank you, Robert. Although you say you're not on that list, I think what you've set out there, I think lots of countries will be facing as well similar issues. So as you say, there was kind of that surge of interest, surge of growth, and then now maybe hitting a kind of bit of a plateau. And then again, you going back to some of those issues that have been raised in terms of your strategy, you need the digital transformation kind of to have been done across the public sector, in particular the skills and the digital literacy of public servants to be able to work with the private sector on this as well, looking at the financing and the funding issues. And then the first question I want to put back, which is really interesting, you say you are considering in your roadmap things like hubs and sandboxes, but maybe you've heard that sandboxes aren't working so well. So maybe there's a bit of a cautionary note around that. Dominic, you've had experience of sandbox, so I just wonder if we could pick up with that, and I might throw it to Karen as well, because you're thinking of the sandbox, is that right? So just your thoughts initially on sandbox as a good way of kind of engaging with the private sector.
Yes. it's a difficult task for me because I was heavily involved in the creation, and of course you don't want to speak badly about your own children. So I would say the expectations were very high. And you know, if we look to our loved friends in the UK, we were always a bit curious how that works, because one of the USPs of sandboxes was kind of, at least implicitly, that you get a regulatory relief of some kind. And that, of course, is not possible. If you see the ESA reports, if you see the European regulation, you cannot give regulatory relief. And in the phase of the creation of the sandbox, it was actually, in Austria at least, clear that we will not give regulatory relief. Of course, within the existing regulatory framework, at some points you have proportionality possibilities that, of course, can be used. But you can't like say, okay, you're in a sandbox now, you don't have to play by the rules. That is not possible. Okay, so the Austrian sandbox has a concept where you actually have to apply to get in, and then you get a close eye from the regulator, and the regulator, I will not say gives you advice, but he will hold you by the hand in order to lead you through a dark forest of regulation. That sounds nice. Mm-hmm. But if I ask to the companies, do you want to have a close eye of the regulator? Probably they will say yes, of course. But if they are among themselves, they probably will talk a bit differently. So what we have seen in Austria is we've had a first wave of applicants. Yeah. Those were actually successfully in the sandbox, and actually some of them are already on the market and still on the market in regular supervision and not within the sandbox anymore. But I would say the interest has faded a bit. Right. So that's what I would say, because if you take the sandbox as it is in Austria, and there is also some voices from the academic who say, why would you go into the sandbox? You have the same rules that apply to you. Everything you have is additional burden, because you have to apply for it, you have to have resources in order to be in the sandbox. Where's the advantage? Yeah. And that's what I wanted to say, that probably my personal learning was, it is something that helps in a big bouquet of measures, but probably there are other things as well. As we have just said, the government probably in its procurement can help giving those fintechs a possibility, but also procurement is a difficult field, as you know, yeah. Also heavily regulated. So probably I would advise some caution there as well. And something where we are now analyzing and researching and looking for good solutions is financing. Yeah. And I would say, as I talked to Peter yesterday in the evening, from our very ad hoc analysis, we would see that the seed and startup phase is actually quite well financed. Yeah. But also on a European level, if you think of our European champions, the scale-up phase is quite difficult. And in the scale-up phase, we see that Austrian startups go somewhere else. Right. If they seek financing for the scale-up phase, in the best case, they look for financing within the EU. In the also good case, they go to our friends in the UK. And in the not so good case, they leave Europe completely and go to the Silicon Valley. And that, of course, is a pity, because I think we have a lot of potential here. And I think we also have quite good benchmark cases. If you think about Airbus, which is now a really successful enterprise, but it's actually a state enterprise, if you will. But it is a European champion, and I would say even a world champion. Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask Karen and then very quickly Peter to come back on this issue of maybe Sam, but also broadly engaging with the private sector and what works and what doesn't work. And then I'm coming to the audience for your questions. Karen, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think, as Dominic said, sandbox is just one element of the ecosystem. But I suppose the corollary is most true. If you don't have a sandbox, then I think there is a gap So I think a sandbox is an important element of the ecosystem. I know my colleague from the central bank is here and we'll talk about that later, so I won't go into it too much, but the industry here are very vocal about the fact that they felt a sandbox was needed. So the governor, as Denise will say, announced last November that you asked for a sandbox, we listened, and we're going to establish a sandbox. So Denise will tell you maybe a bit more about that later on.
Okay. Peter, your thoughts?
Okay, I guess it depends on the definition of what the sandbox is doing, or the innovation hub, or the surgery, or the clinic, call it what you will, at a central bank or a regulator. You know, I think I asked myself this question: how many of the 1,127 regulated fintechs in the European Economic Area needed a sandbox to get authorised? Now, maybe when they're developing more innovative products, where there may be questions as to whether something falls under a rule or a regulation, that's useful, but no central bank or regulator is going to give someone a waiver or create a legitimate expectation that if there's a transgression, there'll be no enhanced advisory action or enforcement action. So who does the sandbox actually help? And I think I do think there are occasions it does help young firms that are trying to innovate, but I actually think it helps more the government and it helps the larger players. And the larger players that want to keep an eye on the younger players that might disrupt them out of business. So to get close to them, we'll collaborate with them in a sandbox. Now, the counter-argument of that is some of the big firms will say, well, look, the reason we don't want to collaborate, even inside a sandbox with a smaller player, is because of the fact that if we do, they could get us in trouble and there's no waiver and there's no right we have not to have action taken against us. And then the smaller firms will argue, well, actually partnering with a big firm, they're just going to steal my intellectual property and take this idea away from me. So I don't think any of those reasons are reasons why there should not be a form of collaboration in a sandbox, but I think it does need a lot of private enterprise involved in it, and not just financial institutions, private enterprise, right? We need people working across the stream to be involved. If there's an ESG element to something, ESG experts, where it was already mentioned, green fintech was mentioned today. And you know, you've got to be, but I think maybe a sandbox could be quite helpful, potentially sometimes, in helping prevent greenwashing, right? So look, I think it depends on what the sandbox is going to do, how it's going to be measured, and how transparent it will be with its findings. But I do think that overall, if there's a budget and there's resources available, that it should be created. But I do think that those that run sandboxes need to be prepared that they may not be inundated from day one with applications.
Thanks, Peter. I'm going to come to Robert. I think that left you with a bit of a helpful answer, but as you said, cautionary, I think, can be helpful, but also some potential risks there. Okay, we're coming to the audience. It's very bright lights up here, so it's hard to see. Yes, we've got a lady down here. We've got roving mics in the room, so if you do want to ask a question, just stick your hand up and we'll come to you. Could you say who you are before you ask the question?
Yeah, hello, my name is Julia Čilikova. I'm coming from the National Bank of Slovakia. Thank you for the very interesting presentation and comments. And for me, it's more comments than the questions about the sandbox. We created the hub and sandbox like the part of the infrastructure, and we also had the experience that the interest about to be a part of the sandbox, it's much less than we expected in the beginning. But I think that is not the reason for the council or of this infrastructure, because I think that it's like the puzzle. The mainly, via the hub are coming the new innovation, new questions, and we are preparing every year to report about the using of the hub. But still, my lesson learned, it's similar what you mentioned, that what is the most important to create the infrastructure and some kind of transparency, and to be open to discuss the potential business model and potential impact of regulations. That it was more comments, because for me it was some kind of additional evidence that is not a fail, that we don't have a full house of the clients which are knocking on the door. I want to be in the sandbox, but it is a normal process, and I think that is not the reason for the counseling that it's important. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Seems like people are having similar experiences, I think, in this. We've got a question from, comment from Ian down here at the front. And a lady at the back as well with her hand. If we can get a mic down there after, thanks.
Thanks, Siobhan. Just one kind of comment on sandboxes is we have a dedicated session on sandboxes because it's cropped up. This is the third Fintech Lab and it's cropped up at all three. So just to kind of look ahead, I think that's at 11:50, I think, moderated by Palmer Baines from the IMF. So for all those interested in sandboxes, a dedicated session. It was just come back actually to Karen's opening remarks and to look ahead to the next session, which is, I think Karen said you've got a couple of use cases up your sleeve, and part of the next session, I think we'll be looking at that as well. So maybe if we could hear those from Karen.
Great, thanks, Ian. Yeah, back to you, Karen.
So thanks, guys. So yeah, I have a couple of use cases that I find really interesting. So the first one is from a company called Clever Cards. So Clever Cards is a digital payments platform, enables businesses and the public sector organizations to configure digital MasterCards and distribute the MasterCards to eligible recipients to download instantly. So a key feature of the platform is the ability to restrict card spending to certain merchants or industries. So the technology that Clever Cards use can be used then by governments to target social benefits such as school meal vouchers, job seeker incentives, housing improvements, health incentives, rewards, and so on. So I think it's a very interesting concept. I think in the UK they have employed this technology. The UK government normally use to distribute payments to the public via plastic cards or vouchers or bank transfer. That can be slow, difficult to track. So to address the challenge, Clever Cards partners with the UK government to introduce a digital MasterCard configured as a utility card, and this incentive provides instant access to energy payments for households. In other words, the credit card is a virtual credit card and can only be used on to pay the 29 utility providers in the UK. Another one then is ID PAL, which is a small Irish company. It is partnering with the HSE to securely verify the identity of individuals. Obviously, there was a data breach earlier on in the Health Authority, so now they are using a fintech company, ID PAL, to help secure the identity of the individuals. So I think ID PAL was able to integrate with the complex legacy systems in place, and the pre-built model was a prime example of how new generation RegTech solutions have the agility to bridge the gaps often present in the government sector. And then a couple of other ones I'll say very quickly. During the pandemic, Revolut gave the Department of Finance anonymised payments data on a weekly basis. This data was used to monitor the economy via real-time changes to consumer spending during COVID, which proved helpful in forecasting consumption and analysing the impact of changes to government restrictions. And then the last case I want to mention, we talked about the ecosystem earlier, and one of the themes and one of the parts of our ecosystem is making sure that we have the skills. And how do we have the skills? Obviously, education is very important. So one of our education measures that we set out in one of our recent action plans was this new FinTech Masters program from Munster Technology University. And so, in fact, there's already a graduate from that course who has set up a FinTech. Connor Hall has set up a startup called Connect Green. And this, as I said earlier, you know, hits both of our priority themes, sustainable finance and fintech. So this Connect Green company is a revolutionary carbon management and exchange SaaS platform. So they bridge the gap between forestry owners and businesses committed to sustainability, allowing for seamless registration, sale and purchase of carbon credits. So that's already a success story from the FinTech Masters in MTU.
Fantastic. So I think fintech and payments, obviously a big area, lots of conversation about that when we do fintech events. But as you're saying, getting more and more targeted in the way that they use the technology and how you can use it for things like targeting social benefits. And then interesting what you say about Revolut and data, because I think using data coming from the private sector to actually inform policy decision development, policy development, really interesting. And then, as you say, that the education piece being another way to foster kind of growth in the fintech sector as well. Thanks so much, Karen. People might have questions on that, but we do have a question at the back there from a lady at the back.
Hello, my name is Romilda Valentina Murmile Rodriguez. I've worked in 54 countries. English is my second language. I speak 8 languages. So I have a global view, but I have a local view. So I'm a non-executive director for a charity. So my first question, so I've got 3 hats today.
We've got, just to let you know, we've got 2 minutes left.
Yeah, so. Okay. So how do you manage, I work for the British government now, not the European Commission anymore. How do you manage across globally dealing with homelessness when there is no ID? I know what the British government was doing. No ID, you're homeless, so how do you deal with payments, etc., with DWP and across governments in Austria and in different countries? I'm interested in that, please.
So the question, could rephrase, how do you deal with kind of using technology solutions for people who maybe don't have a bank account? Maybe
so for example, DWP, you're homeless, they don't have a birth certificate, etc.
Sure.
So I've looked in the European Commission on this, but I'm interested to see how you're dealing with that.
You could maybe re-ask that question again later as well when we have Sudhanshu on a panel, because I think they've done lots of great work in India on this. But
yes,
and I know this is not your, thank you very much for the question, I know this is not maybe your policy area itself, but do you have any thoughts at all on how you would kind of use technology to bring in people maybe who don't have an ID or don't have kind of a bank account? Dominic?
So it is not my area of expertise indeed, so it's a bit difficult for me to reflect on that, but I will try. So first of all, it is a pity if people are homeless, and it is a challenge for social systems in order to fight homelessness and to take away this hardship. Having said that, I think there is a lot of measures already in place. Also, if you're homeless, you can actually get a bank account in Austria, and I think all over the European Union, because there is regulation in place in order to get a basic account. We call it in Austria, I don't know the technical term in the other countries. So also if you're homeless, you can actually get financial services. And of course, something that we in Austria value very highly, also if we're talking here about digitalization, there is still access to cash. So also with cash you can actually, and that is from a cultural perspective still something that is very high valued in Austria, and we actually are very keen to support cash, even though we also support digitalization. So I think it should be a balanced approach. One very last thought, because you said identification, also homeless people, I guess, can be identified because they're not, I get a no, so probably then it is not my level of expertise. But I guess people who are homeless can still be identified. At least in Austria, I would be at least, I have some level of certainty that they can be identified.
Thank you.
So that's probably it.
Robert, and then Karen, did you want to add anything before we have to conclude? Robert.
Maybe, I mean, at least in Slovenia, we don't have any issues related to maybe people not having a bank account. So I think we have a very high percentage of people owning a bank account. But of course, I would echo Dominic in a way that, yeah, we have to think about inclusion as well.
Yeah.
Of course, digitalization is very harsh on certain groups of population, and yes, we need to think thoroughly that we don't exclude somebody just because they can't participate for various reasons. Yeah.
And that's certainly going to come up in the next session, which is all about the future of finance, I think. Karen?
Well, I don't know for certain, but I understand from my instructions here that Clever Cards technology could be used in that instance. I'm reading here that by bringing residents into the fold of digital inclusion, governments in Europe could begin dispersing social welfare payments directly to residents' mobile phones. So perhaps that is an option.
You just add very quickly, they've been doing that for years in Kenya with M-Pesa, right? So there's nothing new in this. Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, and as I say, please do ask that question again, because I think it will be more relevant, I think, for some of our other sessions as well. But thank you so much, our panelists. The clock is flashing, so I think we have reached our time limit for this one. Please join me in a warm round of applause for Karen, for Dominic, for Peter and Robert. Thank you for our first session.